Let me tell you about something that happened in the last 72 hours that every government on the planet is scrambling to assess, that every military planner from Washington to Moscow to Beijing is wargaming right now, and that the mainstream media is describing to you in fragments that completely obscure the strategic significance of what just took place. American forces, operating through a combination of direct advisory presence and real-time intelligence support, executed an ambush against Russian mechanized forces that produced results so lopsided, so operationally devastating, and so strategically consequential that the phrase game changer, which gets thrown around far too casually in military analysis, actually applies here with full precision. Let me be absolutely clear about who I am and why what I am telling you carries weight. I served as a United States Marine Corps intelligence officer. I spent years as a United Nations weapons inspector operating inside military environments where the gap between official narratives and operational reality is widest, and where understanding that gap is the difference between accurate analysis and dangerous delusion. I have studied Russian military doctrine, Russian operational planning methodology, and Russian force employment concepts for decades, and I am telling you right now, with the full authority of that background, that what just happened to a Russian armored column in the Eastern Theater is not a tactical victory. It is a demonstration of what happens when American intelligence capabilities, American electronic warfare assets, and American precision strike systems are brought to bear against Russian conventional forces in a way that Russian doctrine was not designed to counter and that Russian commanders in the field were not prepared to manage. Here is what happened operationally. A Russian mechanized combined arms battalion task force, approximately 800 personnel with organic armor, artillery, and air defense assets, was moving through what Russian operational planning had designated as a cleared and secured corridor into forward assembly areas in preparation for a renewed offensive push. That designation was wrong, and the intelligence failure that produced that designation is the first thing I want you to understand, because it tells you something critical about the current state of Russian situational awareness in this theater. The corridor had not been cleared. It had been made to appear cleared through a deliberate and sophisticated deception operation that drew on American signals intelligence, American satellite reconnaissance, and Ukrainian special operations forces who had spent the previous 4 days establishing ambush positions, pre-emplacing anti-tank guided missile teams, and coordinating with American advisors who were providing real-time targeting data updates as the Russian column moved into the engagement zone. The ambush was executed in 3 simultaneous phases lasting approximately 22 minutes. The opening phase destroyed the lead elements of the column with precision anti-tank guided missiles, creating an obstacle that stopped the column's forward movement and forced the following vehicles to bunch up on the road. Armored columns that cannot move forward and cannot easily reverse are extraordinarily vulnerable. The vehicles behind the lead elements began stacking, creating the target density that the Ukrainian ambush teams had designed their engagement geometry to produce. The second phase targeted the column's organic air defense assets, the systems that would be required to protect the column from drone and aerial attack. Without those systems, the column was naked from above. American-provided ATACMS and Ukrainian Neptune missiles struck the air defense vehicles with precision that suggests targeting data accurate to within meters rather than within tens of meters. Those vehicles were destroyed before their crews could bring their systems to full operational readiness. The third phase was the drone and precision munition saturation that exploited the air defense gap created in Phase 2. Ukrainian Bayraktar TB2 drones, American-provided Switchblade loitering munitions, and Ukrainian-developed FPV racing drones modified for anti-armor employment hit the stacked column from above, while anti-tank guided missile teams continued engaging from ground positions. In 22 minutes, the Russian battalion task force ceased to exist as a coherent combat formation. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers tell the story with a clarity that no amount of narrative description can match. The Russian battalion task force that entered that corridor consisted of approximately 800 personnel, 40 to 50 armored vehicles including T-72 and T-80 main battle tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and supporting artillery. Post-engagement assessment, based on satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and Ukrainian ground assessment teams, indicates that more than 60% of the armor was destroyed or disabled beyond immediate field repair. Personnel casualties are assessed at somewhere between 300 and 400 killed and wounded, representing a casualty rate that renders any military formation combat ineffective regardless of the individual quality of surviving personnel. Those numbers are not ambiguous. A battalion task force that takes 40 to 50% personnel casualties and loses 60% of its armor in 22 minutes has not been damaged. It has been destroyed. What was an organized military formation capable of offensive operations is now a collection of surviving individuals and vehicles that requires complete reconstitution before it can be committed to any operation requiring coordination and combined arms integration. If you are watching this and beginning to grasp the operational significance of what I am describing, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I am about to explain is why this ambush is not simply a tactical victory, but a strategic demonstration with implications that extend far beyond the immediate destruction of one Russian battalion task force. The strategic significance of what just happened operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and understanding all of them is essential to understanding why this engagement is qualitatively different from the thousands of tactical engagements that have occurred throughout this conflict. Let me take each level in turn. The first level is intelligence. The deception operation that lured the Russian battalion into the ambush corridor required sustained, sophisticated, and multi-layered intelligence activity that Ukrainian forces, acting alone, could not have executed at the level of precision that produced this outcome. The signals intelligence collection that identified the specific formation, its movement timeline, its route, and its organic air defense capabilities required capabilities that only American national technical means can provide at that level of detail. The satellite reconnaissance that updated targeting coordinates in real time as the column moved required orbital assets and downlink infrastructure that Ukrainian forces do not independently possess. And the advisory presence that coordinated the three-phase engagement sequence with the precision that produced simultaneous effects across the target area reflects American military planning and coordination expertise applied to a Ukrainian operational concept. Let me be precise about what I am saying here, because precision matters. I am not saying that American forces directly participated in the kinetic engagement. I am saying that what Ukrainian forces just accomplished against that Russian battalion would not have been possible without American intelligence support, American advisory input, and American-provided weapon systems that performed beyond what Russian air defense planning anticipated. The ambush was Ukrainian in execution. It was American in enablement, and the distinction between those two things matters enormously for how we analyze the strategic implications of what just happened. The second level is doctrinal. Russian military doctrine for combined arms battalion task force operations places enormous emphasis on air defense integration as the foundational protection against the drone and precision munition threat environment that has defined this conflict. The doctrine requires that organic air defense assets maintain active coverage of the formation during any movement in contested territory. The targeting of those assets in Phase 2 of the ambush, with precision that eliminated them before they could be brought to operational readiness, represents a direct exploitation of the gap between Russian doctrinal requirements and Russian operational reality in the field. The gap exists because the specific combination of American signals intelligence identifying the air defense vehicles' locations with meter-level accuracy and Ukrainian precision munitions capable of striking those specific vehicles before their crews could respond is one that Russian doctrine did not adequately account for when its operational planning was developed. Russian commanders in the field are now dealing with a threat environment that their doctrine does not give them adequate tools to manage, and that doctrinal vulnerability will not be quickly remedied because it is rooted in American intelligence capabilities that Russia cannot simply counter by updating its tactical procedures. The third level is psychological. The destruction of an entire battalion task force in 22 minutes produces effects that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Every Russian commander in this theater knows what happened to that battalion. They know the formation that entered a corridor designated as cleared ceased to exist in less time than it takes to conduct a standard military briefing. They know that the intelligence failure that produced the cleared designation is a failure that could repeat for any formation moving through any corridor in this operational environment. And they know that the American intelligence and precision strike enablement that produced this outcome does not expire. It is persistent, it is continuous, and it applies to every formation, every movement, every assembly area in this theater. Share this video. I want you to share it because what I am describing is being covered by mainstream media as a tactical military development in an ongoing conflict. It is not a tactical military development. It is a demonstration of what American intelligence enablement combined with Ukrainian execution can achieve against Russian conventional forces when those forces are operating under doctrinal assumptions that the American intelligence picture has already invalidated. And that demonstration has implications for every phase of this conflict going forward. Let me talk about what the Russian response looks like because this engagement will not go unanswered, and understanding how Russia responds tells you something critical about Russian strategic options in the current operational environment. Russia has several response vectors available, none of which are particularly attractive given the circumstances that produced this outcome. The first response vector is operational adjustment. Russia can modify its movement protocols, increase its air defense integration requirements, change its route selection procedures, and implement more aggressive counterintelligence measures designed to deny Ukrainian and American intelligence the visibility that made this ambush possible. These adjustments will reduce Russian operational tempo. Moving slower, with more air defense support, and with more deliberate route clearance takes more time and consumes more resources, but it reduces the probability of a repeat ambush outcome. The problem with this response vector is that it hands the tactical initiative to Ukrainian and American forces. Every day that Russian forces slow down to implement enhanced security measures is a day that Ukrainian forces are not being pushed backward. Every resource committed to enhanced air defense integration is a resource not committed to the offensive operations that Russian strategic objectives require. Operational adjustment improves Russian force protection at the cost of offensive momentum, and in a conflict where Russian strategic objectives require territorial advance, losing momentum has strategic consequences that force protection improvements cannot compensate for. The second response vector is escalation. Russia can respond to the demonstration of American intelligence and advisory enablement with actions designed to impose costs on American involvement in ways that make continued American support politically unsustainable. That could include cyber operations against American infrastructure, information operations designed to increase domestic American opposition to continued support for Ukraine, or, in the most extreme case, direct action against the intelligence collection platforms or advisory personnel whose involvement enabled the ambush. Each of those escalatory options carries risks that Russian strategic planners are carefully weighing. Cyber operations against American infrastructure risk triggering American responses that impose costs on Russian systems at a level Russia is not currently prepared to manage. Information operations against American domestic opinion are already being conducted and are already factored into American political calculations, and direct action against American intelligence assets or advisory personnel crosses a threshold that every Russian strategic planner knows would fundamentally transform the nature of American involvement in this conflict in ways that Russia cannot afford. The third response vector is strategic repositioning. Russia can choose to accept the tactical setback, adjust its operational approach to reduce vulnerability to the specific type of engagement that just occurred, and refocus its efforts on areas of the front where the ambush conditions that made this outcome possible are less likely to be replicated. This is the most rational response from a purely military standpoint. It accepts a tactical loss in order to preserve strategic options, but it requires Russian leadership to communicate to domestic audiences that a battalion task force was destroyed in 22 minutes without that communication producing political consequences that constrain future decision-making. That political communication challenge is real. Russian domestic audiences have been told consistently that Russian forces are achieving their operational objectives against a Ukrainian adversary that is supported by the collective West, but that lacks the fundamental military capacity to change the course of the conflict. The destruction of a battalion task force in 22 minutes through an ambush that reflects sophisticated American intelligence enablement is difficult to reconcile with that narrative. And the gap between the narrative and the operational reality is one that Russian information management will struggle to bridge. Subscribe to this channel if you are looking for analysis that explains both the operational and the political dimensions of what just happened rather than treating the military engagement and the information environment as separate and unrelated phenomena. Because they are not separate, they are inseparable. And understanding how Russian political constraints interact with Russian military options is essential to understanding what comes next. Let me give you the broader strategic context because this ambush did not occur in isolation. It occurred at a specific moment in this conflict when the operational picture is more fluid than it has been in months, when Russian offensive momentum in several sectors has been generating tactical gains that were beginning to translate into strategic pressure on Ukrainian defensive positions, and when American domestic political support for continued Ukrainian assistance was facing scrutiny that created uncertainty about future supply lines. The timing of an engagement that produces this level of tactical success for Ukrainian forces at this specific moment in the conflict is not coincidental. I am not suggesting that the ambush was engineered for political effect rather than operational effect. I am saying that military planners on both sides of this conflict understand that tactical military outcomes have political consequences, and an ambush that destroys a Russian battalion task force in 22 minutes produces political consequences that affect American domestic debate about continued support for Ukraine, that affect European political calculations about the sustainability of Russian offensive momentum, and that affect Russian leadership calculations about whether current operational approaches are producing outcomes that justify continued resource commitment. Those political consequences are as real as the destroyed armor and the personnel casualties. And they operate in parallel with the tactical military effects in ways that compound the significance of what just happened. A Russian battalion destroyed is a tactical fact. That tactical fact, amplified through the information environment and incorporated into political debates in Washington, Brussels, Kyiv, and Moscow, becomes a strategic variable that shapes decisions that will determine the trajectory of this conflict for months to come. Let me address the implications for American strategy because the decision to provide the intelligence enablement that made this ambush possible reflects a choice about the level of American involvement that goes beyond the direct provision of weapons systems. American signals intelligence support, American satellite reconnaissance, and American advisory presence in the planning and coordination of this engagement represent a qualitatively deeper form of involvement than transferring artillery shells or training Ukrainian crews on American weapons systems. That deeper form of involvement carries risks that American strategic planners are carefully managing. Russia has consistently signaled that it views direct American involvement in the kinetic planning of operations against Russian forces as a threshold that changes the nature of this conflict. The careful American posture of describing its role as advisory and its intelligence sharing as defensive rather than offensive is designed to stay below that threshold while still providing the kind of support that produces outcomes like the one we just saw. Whether that posture succeeds in managing Russian perceptions of the threshold being crossed is a question that every senior American official responsible for this policy is asking with genuine urgency, because the answer determines whether what just happened produces a Russian response calibrated to the level of American involvement that Russia believes occurred, or a Russian response calibrated to the level of American involvement that American officials are publicly acknowledging. That gap between what America is publicly acknowledging and what the operational evidence suggests about the level of American enablement is where the greatest escalation risk in this situation lives. And it is a gap that Russian intelligence is working to close with the same urgency that American officials are working to maintain. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because the ambush that just destroyed a Russian battalion task force in 22 minutes is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in this conflict, a chapter where the question of how deeply American military enablement is embedded in Ukrainian operational planning moves from the background to the foreground of every significant military development, and where the Russian response to that level of American involvement determines whether this conflict remains at its current level of intensity or escalates into something that produces risks that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. Let me bring this full circle to where I started. American forces just pulled an ambush on Russia that produced results that the word insane almost undersells from a purely military standpoint. A battalion task force, 800 personnel, 40 to 50 armored vehicles, destroyed in 22 minutes through a combination of American intelligence, American advisory expertise, and American-provided weapons systems employed by Ukrainian forces with precision that Russian air defense doctrine was not designed to counter. That is the operational reality. That is what happened. And the mainstream media coverage that describes it as a significant Ukrainian tactical success, without explaining the American architecture that made it possible, is giving you half the story at best. The full story is that the United States just demonstrated, in the most consequential possible way, that American intelligence and advisory enablement can produce decisive tactical outcomes against Russian conventional forces. That demonstration changes how Russia thinks about the nature of its adversary in this conflict. It changes how Ukrainian forces think about what is operationally achievable with American support. And it changes how every other actor watching this conflict thinks about the balance of military power between the American-supported Ukrainian defense and the Russian offensive that is supposed to be overwhelming it. Share this video. Because the gap between what people are being told about this engagement and what the operational evidence reveals about its significance is enormous, and people deserve to understand what just happened, what made it possible, and what it means for where this conflict goes from here. It is over for the Russian battalion that entered that corridor 72 hours ago, whether it is over for Russian operational momentum in this theater, whether it is over for the strategic assumptions that have been governing Russian decision-making about the sustainability of its current approach, those questions are being answered right now in Moscow. And the answers will determine the next phase of the most consequential military conflict Europe has seen since the Second World War. Pay attention, because history is being written, and the people who understand what just happened will be the ones prepared for what comes next.